the Linux Peter Conference year 17. My name is Vasily Tolstoy. I'm a member of programming committee of the conference, and I'm here with Mr. Lennart Poettering.
Hi.
Hi. This is that very same Lennart Poettering, out of the half of the Linux. The guy with a love-hate relationship with the hacker community. It was a part of introduction, but still, can you introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Lennart Poettering. I work for Red Hat. I work mostly in systemd, but did some other projects before. And I live in Berlin, Germany.
Nice. You made a talk at this conference. Can you compress it mere 100 times and say in a few words what it was about?
Okay, like containers are probably one of the big buzzwords we have in the Linux world these days. Containers are different things to different people, but there are a couple of concepts in there that are interesting beyond the immediate container scope. My talk was about taking some of the concepts that containers are about, specifically sandboxing and resource bundling, and adapting that to classic service management, because that's what systemd is. It's a service manager in style of traditional System 500 and these kind of things. So it's basically about seeing what we can learn from container technology, taking the most interesting bits, at least in my opinion, most interesting bits out of it, and trying to map them into classic service management, because that's what actually is probably, even currently at least, more universally deployed than containers actually are, because it's how we always have been doing service management or computers and service in the world so far. So yeah, that's kind of the summary, and then in my talk I went into a lot of details about specifically which sandboxing features and which resource bundling features there are in systemd and how they compare to what Docker or what other container subsystems support there.
It's actually, I have attended your talk. It was looking close to revolutionary from some point of view, and very interesting thing that it's showed a lot of dimension details which demonstrated that the implementation could be rather full. But as any revolutionary idea, it's a bit frightening at the beginning. So anyone who was missing our conference, PT, or missing the video, you should wait. Embrace yourself, wait for a video and look at it. Then the basic question, but still interesting to ask. What do you think? What interesting things had happened last year? From last November to this November.
And the general Linux ecosystem?
For example.
Wow. I should have thought about that.
Nothing is the answer.
Well, something interesting. What happened in the last year? I don't know.
It was an empty year, ladies and gentlemen. Empty year.
No, that wasn't certainly not the case. I mean, I know what the interesting bits that I hacked on, which was basically what I was talking about. But of course, that's.
But we can take a wider angle and see the tech world in general.
In general, I mean, Linux nowadays is so established that, I mean, it's not making major jumps anymore, right? Like it's more a constant, steady flow of improvement everywhere. And I think, I don't know, like, I mean, there are bigger trends in the industry, like that everything has to be about artificial intelligence and things like that these days. But in Linux specifically, I mean, there's nothing radical happened, like Docker and these things, which definitely did have a major impact on what's currently being done in IT, is already 3 years old or something right now. So that's probably not something I did this year. I don't even know.
So guys, those who slept over all the year, you haven't skipped anything. But just listen to the Mr. Poettering talk of this year, and that's all. We'll get the recollection of the interesting things.
But I think it's actually a good thing, right? Like that, where there's a constant stream of improvements these days, and it's not about radical breaks anymore. It's really just about like at least our basic components of what the ecosystem is made up of is kind of stable-wise these days, I guess. And now we're improving steadily. That kind of is a sign of maturity and professionalism, I guess. So maybe it's a good thing. I don't know.
Quite probably. The next question is connected to this one, but still probably you can think of something. What do you think is the current hype, if there is any?
Well, I guess I already mentioned that a bit, like with the artificial intelligence. I mean, I've always found it interesting, like how these buzzwords in the industry, like make everybody electric for a while and then kind of disappear in the background. Like for example, containers is probably actually a word that it's not this year's word. It's like the magic buzzword from 3 years ago, right? But it's still important, and then it became IoT, and nobody knows what that actually is and why it's different from embedded. And I guess this year it's artificial intelligence, and I mean you just have to look, like for example the Linux Foundation now creates its own artificial intelligence project. So I guess it kind of means that there's something there that everybody has to jump on now, and if you're Google or if you're Linux Foundation or whoever else, that's what you do. So I guess that's the trend. I don't know. I mean, I'm not closely following that. I'm just watching these things from my little distance there, and sometimes find it funny and sometimes interesting. But I guess that's a trend.
Okay. Next, I would like to ask the question, which is even less technical and more, social or whatever. The Linux community itself, and the most prominent figures there, they're getting older, and obviously years are passing, and they're getting significantly older. So, what's your thoughts about that? Do you feel it or just observe it? Has it any implications?
It definitely has implications, right? So, I mean, it's pretty obvious these days that Linux has professionalized and has, like, I mean, I mentioned earlier that might be a good thing, but then again, it might also be a bad thing actually, because I mean, Linux when it came, it was something like when in the 90s and in the early 2000s, when it was still something like a fresh power. It certainly revolutionized a lot of stuff that there was. And that actually brought new things to the table and was a revolution in many ways. That doesn't happen anymore, right? That is, it's now in very clear, it's going in very clear directions, and that is definitely caused by the fact that many of the kernel developers, many of the other project people tend to have grown into a stable life where they just have their projects and continue doing this. I think ultimately it's probably not a good thing, or maybe it is. I don't really know, but it can be a bad thing, I guess, if people are too stuck into the way of thinking that they had in the 90s, because that happens. Like I'm looking at that in my own case as well. Like I always wonder, like, what will I think in 10 years? Will my thinking be stuck in what I thought like 10 years ago, or will I actually manage to go with time and figure out that maybe what I thought back then does not apply anymore to the IT world of in 10 years. So it's I don't know. I see that it's some people in the kernel community and the general Linux community, I guess, handle it better growing older, and others worse. Like some go with the times and figure out that maybe, like for example, like we got this like when we did systemd, like because as you know there were lots of noise about this. We cut off a lot of old concepts that were enshrined in Unix religion, and if you so will, right? Like lots of the old Unix concepts we said this is not actually well designed and how things should be. We need something more modern, like something more dynamic and things like that. And when we did this, we were kind of like these revolutionaries stepping in there and figuring out that this is not the way to go. But we fought major wars against, like for example, something simple, device management in Linux, right? Like it's nowadays a very dynamic affair, right? Like you plug in some hardware, something happens and it becomes available. This is not how Unix was designed, right? Like in Unix, hardware was something that was there. End of story. Like maybe you turned off the computer, replugged, rewired things, booted up again, and then something different would be there, but it was not hot plug or anything like that. Turning Linux into something on all layers of the stack that is inherently dynamic, right? Like where the system adjusts to the way it's put together dynamically, in the way how it's used and things like that. That is a major step ahead, and it was a major fight back then to actually pull that through, to make it go their way. And the old people, they said, oh, the old schemes are so much simpler, and of course they were, but it's of course not where the industry went. Now, I wonder, like, given that systemd is kind of established now, I'm kind of afraid that maybe I I might be eventually the one who says no, all this modern stuff is bad, and I really hope it's not that way.
And you will. But
I don't know. I really try to keep my eye on this so that I'm not.
The
But we'll
extent
see.
of this varies, but we definitely will and see that my stuff was normally revolutionary. This is this stupid, I don't know what.
But I guess it's always the big conflict about new stuff and old stuff, and figuring out how this plays out. I think generally most of the Linux projects, however, are stable enough and established enough that they will survive if their main contributors go away, right? Like, for example, the Linux kernel, nobody has a doubt that should Linus sometimes decide that snorkeling is the only thing he wants to do, I'm pretty sure Linux would just do fine. Nobody would almost notice, right? Like if those people wouldn't show up. I mean, it's so. I mean, the good thing about open source, after all, is that it's distributed on so many different shoulders that if one pair of shoulders goes away, there's so many other shoulders who will step in and make sure it succeeds. And if it doesn't, then it probably usually meant that the project wasn't actually as established and loved and popular as people thought it was, right? So that's, yeah, I mean, it's a big benefit of open source after all, that there's not just one company behind it that owns everything, and when the company or the person goes away, then everything goes away. It's like the good stuff will survive.
And I think we have seen it a number of times in the different subsystems or products which survive total replacement of the crew on board. It's a big philosophical thing, but I see your point. And speaking about these new shoulders and old shoulders, should we, as a community, do something special to bring in new people?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's one of the big things, like especially like if you maintain a big product like I do with systemd, it is one of the hardest things ever is attracting developers and making them stay. Right, like I don't know how to do that actually. Like we managed to do that with a couple of them. Like, but it's like you get like attracting patches to your project is relatively easy still, right? Like because people, they scratch their own itch, send you a patch, you review it, merge it, right? But getting these contributors who sometimes send a patch and turning them into regular contributors, into maintainers even, and finally into people who do reviews of other people's contributions, that is a complicated part, and I don't really know how to do this, right? Like you must make the community so welcoming and so interesting that people stay and focus their time not only on writing code but actually on reviewing code, because I mean it's actually something that most people are not aware of. Like I think contributing like reviews is at least as valuable as it is as writing the original code, right? Like because for every piece of code that is written, there needs to be some reviewer to actually look at it and merge it. And it's probably very much like most of the companies usually just care about writing code. They in the thought process of IT managers, I guess it doesn't even exist. The concept that you have to have somebody who also reviews it. I don't know. But maybe that's just my biased view, because I spend a lot of time on reviews, so I sometimes feel like that part is not appreciated enough. But I think it's a major complexity. Like we want young people to contribute to our stuff, and ultimately we want to grow them into some people who will just do the reviews, who will do the the hard work. But going that way is getting them attracted, and that is hard. And I'm not like, how to make friendly communities, I don't really know how that works. Like the Linux kernel community, I think, has a reputation of not being the friendliest community. On the other hand, they are very successful in growing something, so there's something of a bit of a contradiction there. We have, we definitely have enough maintainers in systemd, but I would have more, always would like to have more. And we try to make it a much friendlier community, like for example, things that are permitted on the kernel mailing list certainly are not permitted on the systemd mailing list, like expressions and things like that, like being too rude to people. We will immediately block them and things like that. Just because I know that when I started with open source, it was frightening going into some of these communities and dealing with well, I wouldn't call it hatred, but with this abrupt, cold way how you sometimes get treated there. So I don't know, what the answer is to make a happy community and make people stick, I don't really know. It's probably just trying to be nice and honoring all the patches that we get, and somehow makes them interested enough to stay around. But if I would know how to grow contributors and maintainers and trees, then I'd probably have some very magic powers in the community.
In this case, I'll ask you to borrow this tree for a while, or to pick the correct word for it, a branch for it to grow in my own pot. The connected question, if we were started talking about the how to say your community, I mean systemd community, and the breaking the old things and dealing with the conflicts. I recall that we were talking about this before, and you told me that you don't know that, but I'll ask it anyway. Just a hypothesis, maybe the number of them. What was the reason behind the success of systemd, which was really controversial thing, as we all know, and still you have your, as I understand, your own share of hate mail, even hate phone calls, which is fantastic. Don't call Mr. Poettering saying you want to kill him.
Well, I mean, we don't get that much anymore, right? Like it's on the past, I guess.
First of all, he's alive. You failed.
But it's like. I think the main reason why we managed to pull that through and why others didn't or something is that for some reason the people who did systemd back then, including me, were wired in a way that this pressure that we got didn't affect us or something. And I mean, okay, it's not that it didn't affect us at all, but it's something we can deal with. Like, I personally, like, if some idiot on the internet tells me that I'm stupid, then I can very easily brush that off because it basically, if I don't have technical respect or something for somebody, then then his opinion doesn't hurt me that much, I guess.
You're psychologically blessed. I guess
it's like, I mean, but it's shitty that it's that way, to be honest. Like, I mean, I think, like, if you're lucky enough to have the thick skin that you can deal with this, you'll have a much happier time in open source. Yeah. And if you're not built that way, then you have a problem, I think. So I think that's a major reason. But then again, I'm totally puzzled myself why we managed to pull that through and other people didn't. I don't know. Another reason might be simply, in contrast to what some people say, I think systemd actually has relatively good documentation, right? It's always not good enough, because it never is good enough. But I think still, we spend a lot of time on documentation. And I think this is kind of like, basically everything that we did, or most of the things that we did, we had the documentation right from the beginning. And doing that probably gets a long way, right? And I see a lot of projects that are technically excellent, but where people do not write the necessary amounts of documentation, right? And that makes it very, very hard to already discuss with them. And then I guess it's about going to conferences and convincing people. And I mean, it's what I'd love to do, right? Like coming to a conference like this one here to St. Petersburg and actually like collect the feedback and see what people actually think. And in contrast to what some people might think, we actually do care about what people tell us, right? Like, especially like in the talk I did here earlier, it's like collecting the feedback and the questions, right? Like, because you, regardless if people explicitly ask based on their use cases, but you always get a message, like you get a sense for what people are actually looking for, right? For example, there was one really interesting question there regarding like this dynamic user feature that we have in systemd and dynamic groups and stuff like that. And it's like the questions make you think about, okay, this is a different perspective on the stuff that I'm doing here. What does this actually mean for my work, and can I incorporate like his use case into the use cases that I actually care about to make it more generically useful. So yeah, I guess it's about going to conference and listen to people. Even sometimes people think we wouldn't listen, but actually we do a lot. It's just we don't fulfill all wishes. We just fulfill the wishes that we consider core and central, and put the right priority. After all, we're just people, right? Like we have limited amount of time, and somehow, you know, systemd is a large project these days, but we still have to to kind of figure out what we actually want to do and what we don't want to do. It's at least as important knowing what areas you don't want to touch as it is to know which areas you actually want to touch with the project you do. But yeah, that's my answer to that.
It was a very full answer. So, an interesting. So, speaking again about the new people, by the way, why just new people? Old ones too. Do you have any on your mind? Probably it's very, very subjective and personal. On your mind, any information source like, some fine piece of documentation, the video blog, whatever, IRC channel, specific person to follow up, some source of information which you can recommend to anyone saying, oh, you didn't see that, drop everything else, go there and see if even you think that you know the issue, go there and reiterate what it would be.
Like in general on Linux, or
in Linux and programming, let's limit to this.
So I think I can, when I got into open source, the one thing that got me hooked, that got me the most interested in what I was doing, was actually going to the first conference I went to, which was a GNOME conference in Barcelona back then. It's the one thing, back then I didn't know anybody in open source, right? And I didn't understand that the people who do open source are usually pretty nice people, right? So what got me hooked was much less the technical stuff. I mean, I liked the technical stuff a lot, right? That's kind of what I did. But what made me stick with it is definitely the fact that I realized it's awesome going to conferences and talking to people. And I mean, that conference was a special one. It was on the beach in Barcelona, so it's very hard to but this one's actually kind of nice too. But it was
we have a certain problem with beaches, but
yeah, the beaches here are probably a lot colder. But anyway, I would never underestimate the human factor. Go to conferences, and then you realize that hacking is awesome, but actually hacking in a way that people use your stuff and cooperate with you, and you have feedback about it, because everything's about feedback. That's the big thing, right? For example, I would recommend every newcomer to open source to visit FOSDEM or something. I know it's a little bit harder to go there from Russia because of visa problems. It's a conference in Brussels, by the way, yearly free conference. But it's a great way to get started, because I mean, at least initially you don't even know so much, I guess, what the project is you're actually interested in. Do you want to do kernel stuff? Do you want to do service management? Of course you do, by the way. But or do you want to do something completely different, on the web side of things, or artificial intelligence at FOSDEM, because it's so large and it's free and it's everybody's there. And it's kind of nice to go there and just look what there is, right? It is a very different conference than this one, I guess, because this one is highly technical and focused, and for I guess it's for people who already have a rough idea what they want to do in open source. But FOSDEM is it's an excellent conference where you can just get a completely random idea. But then again, you should also come to this conference, of course, because if you do Linux, it's probably a really good place to get information. At least I learned stuff here. So I don't know. Yeah, go to conferences. This one, FOSDEM, it's the best way to get introduced. And other than that, learn to hack, I guess. Usually helps if you know your way around computers. But it's not. It's of course not a requirement to be very successful in open source, because open source is so much more than just hacking, right? It's documentation and the artwork things and everything else. There's so much stuff you can do in open source, and so ultimately, I guess it's code that everything comes around. But yeah, that would be my answer. Go to conferences and make yourself at home in what open source is. Thankfully, most of the open source projects, I mean, by definition, are open, so you can study the sources. So even if the documentation is sometimes not as good as it could be, the sources are the ultimate documentation in most cases. So if you're puzzled about something, there's always a very clear way how you can figure out the solution to what you're looking for, because you can read the sources. Reading sources is hard, right? Like it's especially if you're not used to it, because it forces you to think like other people think, right? Like because you have to kind of warp your mind into the mind of somebody else.
It's a very interesting point. I'm always telling to children and students of different kinds. So the most interesting part of fixing the machine or dealing with the programming code is not the machine and the code, it's the people behind it. So actually contacting your mind with the mind of the previous engineer, which is much more interesting because it has a psychological part. It's not just a mechanical thing.
It opens new doors, right? Like because everybody thinks different, like, and everybody will, like, you give 10 people that the same problem that they shall implement in code, and you will get 15 answers back, like how you can actually do it, right? And then I'm pretty sure that when I would do that, I would not have come to the idea that 13 of those are even possible, right? So it's very educating, I guess, actively reading code. For me it is, and I'm pretty sure for everybody else who's doing free software and wants to get into free software, that's one of the big things that you can just go and do that. I mean, closed software that's so different. Like, if I want to know how the glyph setting algorithm in Microsoft Word is put together, yeah, forget it. I can't because it's closed source, right?
By the way, it's interesting to know because now we have the open source things like Word, so we can dismantle it and see that. By the way, it's non-trivial things happening inside these classical things like a usual text processor, and then the newest one with the typographical settings. So.
Yeah, I mean, everybody has like the LaTeX stuff from Donald Knuth back then, like the algorithms behind that, like they are really, really interesting, right? So, and the fact that all of that is open, and especially tech is so well documented, like because it's its own document, like the source code and documentation are interwoven. It's actually a very educating experience. So
actually, I've answered my next question, but because I was trying to ask, as a lot of people before, what I can say to the younger guys who are thinking, should they go into tech, should they deal with open source, or is it just a waste of time, and they will, is it interesting or not, what they will get, how we can get it, and basically standing on the starting line, not knowing what to do, but actually have already given a lot of recommendation to grow the thick skin, go to the beaches as much as possible, see as much people rave with a huge crowd in Berlin. We're definitely speaking about the programming, not about the rave party. Then read the source code. This will distinguish you from other guys. Read the source code and do your own hacks. But I will be seeing something. What you can add on top of that?
On top of that, what you can add? What do you mean? Like, let's imagine that the younger audience on the other side of this camera is waiting a piece of your wisdom to think, what to do with their life? The Linux open source and those symbolical heaven of programming is so beautiful, but other world is also nice, and what should I do? So why? Well, first of all, there's money, right? Like, if you do technology, if you do open source, it's not only that you have a fun job, because you do, right? Like, at least if you actually like hacking, of course. But if you like hacking, then you are fun. Usually, most of the open source jobs, as far as I know, at least, and experience, that you have a lot more freedom than in traditional software companies. But also, it's a very international community, right? Like it brings me, for example, to places like St. Petersburg, and I love to travel. So if you actually love traveling, or if you love dealing with people from different backgrounds, from different countries, different communities, then opens if I compare that with the people I went to school with, what they experience with their jobs, right? I can say I think I'm really happy with the fact that I can travel around to conferences and speak and hang out with people like you and have a vodka or two, because yeah, I mean it's a special thing, right? Like because we're so international, because of the internet is so built into everything we do, like our entire development process, everything's built around the internet, right? It's inherently a very, very international thing, right? Like for example, for systemd, the people who contribute to systemd, a couple of Germans, but most people are probably outside of Germany, like the Americans, of course, the Russians who contribute, there are people from India who contribute, there are people from everywhere around the world, and there are very few other industries where you get this kind of international exposure and things like that. So, I mean, of course, I'm pretty sure, I mean, you shouldn't now assume that all the free software hackers live this jet set life and jet around the world, because we don't. But we still have, besides the hacking, it's definitely the exposure to interesting cultures and yeah, meeting people, I guess.
So it was extremely positive representation of a job of a computer hacker. Thank you.
Yeah, I like my job. Anyway, thank you.